accounted for, other than Councilman Hypes, who may not be able to join us this evening. As always, we begin our meetings with the Pledge of Allegiance, so if you're willing and able, please stand and join us. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So as we begin this work session, I'll just make sure that everyone in the public is aware that these items are for City Council discussion only and will not be voted on this evening. This is just an informational session, and announce that the item for proposed amendments to the Code of the City of Alpharetta Lift Assist will requests and fees may be removed from tonight's agenda depending on the time that we take up with the budget. So I just wanted to give you all a heads up on that item as well. So we'll begin with the fiscal year 2025 budget. Mr. Harris.
Good. Mayor and Council, before you is obviously our workshop on the 25 fiscal year budget. Obviously, it's preliminary stages, and we have our year, our actual formal approval process noted in the calendar at the end, where we vote on the actual budget. But first, just the agenda itself. Obviously, we're going to talk about how the process this year has gone, some of the concepts that we're trying to cover strategically in the budget, not just this year, but pretty much every year, and then we dive into the budget. A lot of these first few slides are more narrative in nature, and I'm going to try to go through them relatively fast unless there's an issue or something, and some of it's more historical as well. So obviously the budget starts real early. Honestly, even the capital projects for the 25 fiscal year are being reviewed, and new ones are being looked at by our department heads early part of the fiscal year that we're in right now. Then we had the council retreat, and I pretty much give you an idea of how we finished last year, how much fund balance, how much capital we're going to be able to serve with that carry forward fund balance, et cetera. And then we get direction also on where we're heading with our plan. So we then set up target budgets with our departments. If looks like they need a little bit more money in repairs and maintenance and things like this or contractual, then we're going to put that in their budget, and then we're going to remove things that they aren't going to spend next year. Let's say they had some professional service or professional fee that they paid for, and it's not going to happen again this year. We'll remove it. But between the two parties, that's their base budget, and the whole process that you'll see later in this evening is that it's get the base budget done, get the base revenues done, and then see how much dollars we have for new initiatives on the operating and capital side of the equation. So since that time, and again, great job by Chris Lagerbloom and the new approach here. I think the department heads pretty much individually were involved up through January, and then cooperatively since that time, very much completely involved with what the initiatives are, the things we need to accomplish, and joint sit around the meetings and go, well, I can understand why that department needs that. So it's nothing is shocking from a department head that what another department head has requested or what is recommended here. So the budget does released on May 3rd. We have thanks to Sean, we have a great transparency website and transparency modules that you can look at everything from historical historical revenues, et cetera, including the 2025 budget. Okay, so now some of the things, obviously, every year we're always talking about where we stand with our competitive tax rate. We'd always like to show what kind of tax savings we are providing through our homestead exemptions. And this year, 2 years in a row now, the council has adopted an annual action plan that sort of gives us some direction on how our priorities are stacking up along with those action plan. And, last few years, you'll see in a minute, we have historical slides in here on the compensation and staffing over the last few years, how that's become a priority just to make sure we're competitive in our North Fulton market. Obviously, we've had inflationary issues. We have to make sure the budgets are covering that just in their base budgets. And then we talk about service expansion. So with the next slide, this is something we've done historically. It doesn't look like much changes across the top, but I want to try to explain the blue and the red, et cetera. So we again, this year in the original proposed budget is to keep the millage rate the same. A couple things happen when you do that. If the debt service that we have right now, which is about 6.6 million or something like that in that regard, that we got to fund through a debt service millage rate, and that is the 0.740 millage rate. As you have level debt, because your debt is, we've wrapped our debt around it's wrapped it around each other, and I think through 2041, that payment is about 7 million, and when the digest goes up, then you technically don't need to levy that same millage rate. So historically, if you look in 2017, it's the red jumped up from a 0.75 to a 1.130. And that's because we issued the 52 million in 2016. And then that starts dropping back down again. It goes into the operating fund. And because we're usually trying to pay for new initiatives or capital with that, we've historically went out to the market and said, or to the public and said, we think we could do a GO bond and not have to raise the overall millage rate. Now, that may be something down the road we have to discuss, but that is historically how we've done it. So then you have it technically available in the general fund to some capacity, and you pump it back in on the debt side. So you can see the same thing happened in after 2022. So this year we're in the other side of the equation where we're bringing it back over 0.059 mils over. That's about $400,000 to the general fund, and that alone will give some relief to a homesteaded property because now more of their millage rate is applicable to the operating millage rate as a total of the 5.75, and the operating millage rate is the rate that gets to take advantage of the homestead exemptions. They don't all apply for the debt millage. They apply for the operating millage. So that in that regard, you obviously have some value to the homeowners. Then the next slide we try to show is how do we compare? Obviously, we all have different structures in government. How over the years our council has decided to give a little bit more in homestead exemptions than the other cities around us, and you can see that to the far right of 45,000, et cetera. So if we just took the first left part of that, we're just looking at our millage rates and how we stack up, and Alpharetta on operations would be relatively high, debt service relatively high. Again, some cities have not, either through their own desire to make massive improvements to their parks or build more parks or do things for their roads, et cetera, and like we have over the years, or deal with, in different manners, stormwater and everything else, we sort of go about it differently. But if you then bring in what's the effective impact of us offering a $45,000 homestead and everybody else also offering a $15,000 homestead, you can see where that pushes our operations to from an operating millage rate to the average homeowner on an average, I think this is last year's number, $650,000 average homestead value, taxable value. So that's what we're trying to show there. I don't know if there's any questions on that. And again, there's other things. Some of those cities have a stormwater fee. We don't have a stormwater fee, so some argument of why your operations may be a little bit higher because you're covering it, that mechanism, and some of them are actually probably passing a little bit more on to their commercial side, not through a homestead exemption, but through higher occupancy tax fees. So, but anyways, that's sort of the comparison, how we stack up with the cities around us. Again, preliminarily, we don't know what they're going to do with their millage rates as well. They're in this process. This is all based on last year stuff. So just real quick, the $8.7 million we give in homestead exemptions. Now, part of that was the recent enactment of the floating homestead that caps your homesteaded value, where your taxable value of which you'll apply the millage rate to will not go up greater than CPI or 3%. So, but that floating homestead amounts to about $5.2 million of revenues that have been shifted out of, that could have been funded. Obviously, you would have been questioning whether or not your millage rate was right or not, and maybe you need to lower it or something else, but you're giving $5.7 million of relief from the valuation of those properties on that. And then the next one is the basic homestead, and back in 2021, we took it to $45,000, so that amounts to about $3 million. So those are the two primary numbers out of the $8.7 million annually tax relief to our homeowners. And obviously, our homestead exemption is one of the largest in the state. Next, again, we just wanted to show that obviously we think we'd be able to, the departments would be able to align a lot of their initiatives to what the council approved in their annual action plan for this fiscal year. So those are those items. The next slides deal primarily with compensation and what we've done the last few years to try to make sure that we're a top-tier employer in our North Fulton market across on the full spectrum of our employee base. So you can see in the following slides, all I did at this point is show some of the things that council has been very proactive on since 2020. And obviously that builds up the base of your budget, is growing by each of these incremental steps. But again, it's keeping us in the competitive, top of the competitive game. So 20, you had a public safety compensation plan, and then in addition to our merit programs, just, for example, 2021, we had a class and comp study that was an additional to a performance merit program. 2022 is when we started doing some market. It's pretty much a real quick market adjustment because of things that were going on in the country and with Sandy Springs and some other cities where they made a very targeted approach to compensation to their public safety in E911, or police officer, excuse me, in E911. So that was the impetus behind that. And then you go on to 23, we then started dealing with some of the compression adjustments citywide. And then last year, as you know, we took a more firm policy approach to what we're going to do for staying in the market as it relates to being a top tier employer. And by doing that, we had to fund about $1.7 million to bring across the board the department employees up to the basically top two of our competitors. So, and then this year, we include in our base budget a 4% merit program, so that's in the base. We just make this other point that we've also addressed as one of the operating initiatives, the continuation of that market-driven approach to, for all employees, who's below the market, where are they, and how much impact that would be. So that's actually an operating initiative for you guys to obviously review and approve as far as the new initiatives. Staffing, just some similar type stuff. We've really, in the last few years, again, have since 2020, we've added 29 positions, 22 and a half of which are in public safety. Then there's a spotted bunch of them that we go through on down the road. But you can see we're starting on slide 16 that public safety had 5.5, but 911 was 3 of those in 911. And then on down in 2022, we had the Quint staffing, if you remember that, and we got 6 versus 12 we would have had to get if we went for that model. 23, we had 6 FTEs made up of 4 police officers, community paramedic, crime scene, and then we had some other positions again. And in fiscal year 24, we started our real crime center, et cetera. So that's the year we're in right now where we have those FTEs. So the next slide sort of jumps ahead a little bit and just says we are looking at staffing as well when you look at our operating initiatives in a minute, but I think we can deal with those more at the end when we get into operating initiatives. But just so you know that, again, it was something we're trying to make sure we're competitive and also making sure that we're able to provide the delivery that and the service delivery that you all expect and our public expects. Again, this is sort of just a statement. Obviously, we're trying to make sure we deal with inflationary issues and et cetera. So then let's jump right into the big pie chart dashboard of municipal government and how it all sort of shakes out. So it's a $164 million budget. Last year was 154 million. That's a 6.5% growth. That can sometimes be misleading because there's a lot of moving dollars from one pot to another pot, because in government you have to make sure that you manage those funds according to a budget, and sometimes restricted to what kind of funds you can spend that money in and how to account for those funds. So, anyways, you can see to the right, you see the nature of a lot of these funds and what makes them up. Obviously, the general fund is now is 103 million, and we're going to go into that detail of how that was increased from last year and what it looks like. Then some of the special revenue funds, I just want to point out, obviously, E911 fund is the $1.50 that you get on the phone service, I think, so they can pay for the emergency dispatch, et cetera. So Milton pays in about 1.25 million of that 5.7 that you see there, and we, as our $1.50, is picking up the rest. Impact fee fund, that's primarily just the residual left over from the year before. We don't, sometimes very difficult to estimate going forward, so we know what we're sitting on as far as roads and parks and public safety. And so those are those balances, and we do bring them in. You'll see in a minute when we get into the capital parks, some of the money, $231,000 is paying for North Point bathroom design. A portion of that's paying for that, and public safety. This is helping fund the $3 million construction cost related to the fire station renovation. So the impact fee will play some role in funding capital projects depending on, is it an expansionary project or not. Expansive in the sense that new development created expansion or more services. So that's that fund. The hotel motel fund, that's the 8 pennies. That's the full of what the 8 pennies provides us on, 3,929 hotel rooms throughout the city. 9.3 million, that gets split up. The ACVB gets the biggest portion, a little over 4 million. That's their 3.5 pennies. The general fund gets 3 pennies. That is up above in your general fund 103 million because it comes in from the hotel motel. So we're getting 3.5 million from 3 pennies. And then the facilities penny under the state law, it's called that. It's 1.5 pennies. About 1.8 million is staying in the fund to pay for the convention center bonds. Okay, so those are the revenues, special revenue funds, and then we, after that, I keep thinking echo, and it may just be me, but the capital project fund and the stormwater fund, those two funds together, 17.5 million, is generally being driven from dollars that come from the general fund, primarily. They'll have some fund balance that they're sitting on from the year before because we didn't want to spend it or we want to held it back, but primarily that's coming from the general fund, and we'll show you that number in a minute. But debt service fund, just use the fund for the extra mills that we talked about a minute ago to service the debt service on about 100 and, no, I had that number somewhere, 94 million is in outstanding still of our bonds. Then you have the internal service funds, again, in government. Sometimes you want to create another fund to pay for everything and then charge the general fund or charge the E911 fund and then charge maybe the sanitation fund. And so that's the purpose of internal service funds. So one pays for our risk management, pays for all our claims, expenses, and liability insurances, and auto insurance, et cetera. And then the medical insurance fund pays, as it says, all the premiums, et cetera, for the medical. And the last is the OPEB reimbursement benefit fund, the fund we recently created and that we service by the general fund transfers that money over, and E911 fund. So next is the slide, really, when we're going to dive into the general fund revenue comparison. Little pluses, minuses throughout. Obviously, at the end, if you look all the way down below, it will say operating revenues of that fund in the recommended, that's the blue, at least it shows up on mine as blue, at $94 million. That's a $3.1 million more from a budget-to-budget standpoint, 3.162, and that's 3.5%. So a lot of pluses, a lot of minuses, and I'll go through a few of those now. And then after that, you see the carry-forward fund balance. That's how much money we're sitting on after we have our emergency reserve, et cetera, and we bring in to fund capital. But just real quick, if you take the current year property taxes, the best way to look at that one, what we try to do here is show the amended 24 budget, and then what we really think we're going to collect this year is that next column. And so then you have next year's budget. So the first is budget to budget, and then the next is estimated to budget, because sometimes we may have, overestimated budget or underestimated the budget. So what's the estimate and what's really happening in the market, et cetera, when you try to do actual or the estimate for this year to next year's budget. So we try to break it in. I know it's a lot of columns, but if you look at the current year property taxes, where we expect to get $33.18 million with a $2.5 million growth, go all the way over, and the estimate is $2,030,000. We expect 6.5% growth. 6% we expect in growth in residential valuations. Residential makes up 45% of the taxable value of our digest. After you take in homestead exemptions and everything else. And remember, about 2/3 are homesteaded. Now, when they're homesteaded, but if they sell or flip over, then a certain portion of them are not homesteaded, and we'll pick up that money. But if no one sold one, 2/3 of your residential properties are homesteaded, okay? So, but because of turnover, because of non-homesteaded property values, we think we're going to get 6% overall, well beyond the 3% cap that's in the homesteaded properties, if that makes sense. So, and then the commercial, we expect, 4%. We have new construction built in there. We have the millage shift, and so that all amounts to a 6.5% growth over that. And it's very much dead on to the same growth that we actually are going to get this year compared to last year's actual to actual. So after that, it really gets into motor vehicles doing fine. That's the 7% you get when you buy a new car. Vehicles are still expensive. People are buying them. That's been a blessing that we've been a little bit low in our budget, and we're picking that up. Local option sales tax, unfortunately, could be a combination of two things. One was we were going into last year, March, up to about March or April, things were really looking well with local option sales tax. And then, not that they did bad, they just have slowed down. So I think our estimate was a little high, and that's why you see to the estimate, it's only a 1.6% growth of 350,000. And part of it is there's a small fraction that is going to the county. I can't recall that right now, but because you remember during the negotiations, the county picked up from all of the cities a little bit more, so we had to give up some. And but part of that is a combination, like I said. I think there's just obviously inflation's causing things to go up, but then people are only going to spend so much on some stuff. So some of those numbers have not risen, they've slowed down, and then we also probably have coupled with that a little higher estimate last year than we should have. Franchise fees, we talk about that. It's in our monthly report all the time. Georgia Power, we sort of were surprised at the number that we got from their franchise fee of 4% on their gross sales inside the city. And, they'll say it was a milder winter and a milder summer, if that makes any sense. And other reasons, people using more efficient things or whatever, but we got less. So that number's down, and we have to check, it was down a couple 100,000. And that's the primary driver of that 6.7, is about 4 to 5 is Georgia Power and Sawney. Other than that, it's, a little bit around all over the place, unless you got questions. Obviously, the school bus citation or speed citation, school bus areas, we knew that when we put that revenue in years ago that it was, people only get burned so often and then they sort of slow down. So that number two is down there in the fines and forfeitures along with court fines. So that's obviously, I think the school bus citation is down from 1.1 to 750,000. So is our projection. So that's it, again, like I said, from the revenue side, and then the next slide sort of details the general fund expense side, and just like every year, primarily 70% of your budget in a government is personnel related, the salaries and the benefits, et cetera. And it's just by nature, generally speaking, you do a lot of capital through T-Splost and all that, I get it, but I mean, from the general fund perspective, it's usually 70% of the budget. So, and you see that reflected here, that if you got pretty good that we were able to give a 4% across the, 4% merit plus have some of the targeted, although that's not in this number, I apologize, but the 4% is in this number. But overall for personnel, we're keeping it at 3%. Part of that's good because our health insurance did not go up proportionally with that. So that was good. So M&O is primarily driven by something we all knew last year as a council. It sort of was when we had to fund the new CAD system for public safety, and in addition to that $2 million plus cost, I'm trying to remember what it is, somewhere around that, but you actually have the annual lease, not lease, but the software usage charges. So that Hexagon project is costing net to us $626,000. Milton's coming on board and is going to pay us $140,000, their respective cost share of that. And so if you were to remove that, if we did not have that as an operating issue, those target budgets we talked about, some things went up for fuel, or not really fuel as much, but for repairs of vehicles and stuff because of the time lag and some of the cars we're getting and things like that. Some of those costs have gone up, but if you remove the Hexagon impact, we'd only be up 1.7% in our operating budgets. And again, because departments do a real good job working with Sean's team at fine-tuning what they got to do. So at the end of that, after we bring the revenues, expenditures, and match them up, you have $2,035,000 for new and operating initiatives. And that's that line item there. Sorry for the small print, but you'll see, and to the left we say $2 million, but it's $2,035,000. The capital fund transfer, as we talk about every year, is made up of two things. One is a line item in the budget that we left it the same this year at $4 million, same line item. So just like a police officer or anything else, there is a line item in the budget, $4 million to fund for capital. Then there's how well did we finish the 23 fiscal year audited, closed, revenues dropped to the bottom line, some expenditures dropped to the bottom line. That number is 9.4 million, down from 10.5 the year before, down from 12 million the year before. It's getting back down to the reasonable, theoretically, the reasonable number where we expect somewhere between 5% or 10% revenue, 5% for revenue, 5% for expenses, and get 10 plus million dropping to that line. Rating agencies want to see you be conservative in the operating budgets, both revenues and expenditures. And that number is now 9.4, and we're bringing it over to 14 million, providing 13.4 million for our capital. And we'll talk later about those capital projects and what it's funding, et cetera. So with that, we'll jump into the operating initiatives, which I will show you here, and I'll read them to you, but if you have the real tough questions, you can ask those department heads that are standing behind me, hoping they don't have to say anything. So, but that's it, primarily though, but right out of the box though, just a few things. We have that wage adjustments. We just put it in terms of 2%, but it's not 2% across the board. It's just that's the impact of the budget was about 2% of payroll cost. But it's $913,000, and that again brings is a specific study and analysis by the HR and benefits team to look at us to the 5 North Fulton cities and see where we need to adjust to put us at the pay range for those individuals where it's competitive with the market around us. And so that's about $913,000. And I think Chris is the in-house expert on the AMR North Fulton subsidy, but I think you've all heard quite a bit about that they're running at a sort of a deficit and need some subsidization, or they've been subsidizing and they need some funds. So that's $380,000. And then the rest are these operating initiatives, again, that the departments all sat down and went over. The few of them, I just want to note some of the positions down below you'll see in bold. And I think it's a wise decision this year that we put some of those positions in sort of a holding pattern, that we believe these are the highest priority. Not talking about economic development director or the admin assistant or the court admin assistant, because Milton's paying for a portion of that. But the other positions, and we'll wait to January 1st to see how the revenue comes in, and then Chris would be authorized to tell you all is good and move forward on filling those positions. But if something were to change, we could deal with that. So that's it. And then the following slides deal with the unfunded operating initiatives.
Tom,
And yes,
I believe we have a question.
Sure.
Councilman Mitchell?
All right, I wasn't sure if we could, if it was appropriate right now or not. The AMR North Fulton subsidy, what are we doing? Are we doing anything, or can we do anything to control those costs?
We can, and Councilmember, that's a great question, and I was going to try to break in and talk just briefly about the AMR subsidy. So our contract that we've had with AMR has been terminated for some time. They terminated it and chose to ask to renegotiate a future contract, because as the zone provider, they're under no obligation to have a contract with us. They can just provide service in the zone, and we basically provide service until they get there, and there's really no performance standard. So we've been working for the better part of the last year and a half with AMR leadership, as well as our other colleagues in North Fulton, to come up with a new contract, a service level agreement that we can put in front of our city councils. We're nearing the finish line of that, and a couple of highlights is prior to bringing forward a new service level agreement, Sandy Springs was not in the mix. If you recall, Sandy Springs was on an island subsidizing their own buy-up and service, and the other North Fulton cities were not. Sandy Springs is back at the table, and our recommendation is going to come in the form of in this subsidy being split by a formula that we crafted of 2 different things, one being our city's population and one being a 3-year rolling average on calls for service, each of those being equally weighted at 50%. Based upon those 2 criteria, if you all adopt a service level agreement, which we will be presenting to you the first meeting in June, we wanted to be ahead of the game and have an idea as to what dollar figure would be needed to fund that. Sandy Springs is really the one under a crunch to get a contract adopted, because they expire on June the 30th, and they need something moving forward. So they either have to be with us or without us, but moving forward. My preference and recommendation will be that they are with us and not moving forward without us. And so this dollar figure would adjust slightly every year. It would put us into a formula basis for the length of this contract, which I think takes us out to either 5 or 7 years. But it is a system that is designed around a 12-minute response time, and one that has, I'll explain it more on June, whenever that first meeting is in June, but it has performance thresholds that they have to meet. It has penalties for non-performance. It has reporting requirements. It has the creation of the Emergency Medical Oversight Committee, again, as a regulating and supervising body to make sure they stay in compliance with the contract that we would adopt with them. So this number would be a first-year funding of what our portion of that essentially $2 million subsidy is for the 5 cities in North Fulton.
Okay. Can I follow up on that? I've been asked by a couple of people, why do they charge the citizens so much for an ambulance ride? And is there any way we can compare that with other cities and come up with a reasonable amount? Because from the feedback I've heard, and I don't know if you've heard about this or not, but it's outlandish, the amount they're charging the citizen in addition to the subsidy. So how can we put some boundaries on that as far as what they're charging our citizen per mile, or however we choose to?
Yeah, so we don't get a lot into yet in Georgia rate setting, but the insurance industry and the paying rate of insurance pays for ambulance transports are sort of all over the board. There are some that are very underpaying when it comes to transport. I mean, we would even have some people in Alpharetta that would be self-paying. We did, and you'll see leave in this contract that if we are granted the ability to adopt rates as municipalities in Georgia, which has been a push of the legislature for the last couple of years, and if in fact that's successful, and maybe we should talk more about that as we get to the next legislative session, as to what influence we might have over rate setting or over insurance paying. That's probably a great next step after we get this contract adopted to do just what you're speaking of, which is to keep the rates reasonable for the people in Alpharetta.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Councilman Hypes?
You indicated the negotiations center around population and calls for service.
That's correct. As just a formula basis, we all looked at each other and said, we got to split this up somehow.
I take it that's nighttime population for Alpharetta.
Census population.
Yeah. And then what is the calls for service? Is it for ambulance calls for service, or is it something broader than that? And is it objective data, or is it subjective as to each city, where some folks do a little better job of tracking calls for service and others don't?
Well, these are all calls for service that are tracked by our dispatch centers, not by the ambulance company itself. So this would be a self-generating number, and I've got to think that that data point is better than relying upon data that's not ours.
I recall on a discussion about a hotel ordinance and calls for service going to hotel parking lots. Now, it wasn't ambulance data, but it was calls for service as related to the impact it had on public safety, and that's what that's really where the gist of my question is, because there's a lot of ways to measure what is a call for service and what isn't. So I just...
This is calls for service in which an ambulance is required to, or at least an ambulance is dispatched. They don't always get there before they get canceled, but calls for service that an ambulance is dispatched.
Any other questions around this item? Please proceed, sir.
Okay, slide 27, as you know, again, we show the unfunded operating initiatives. These are the other items that the department heads felt had some prioritization or some desire to try to get into the budget, but agreed ultimately after we shook it all out that those other ones were more important. So that list comes to a net cost of almost 1.2 million of impact. The next is okay. So now the capital. How do we fund our capital plan? And we do have a 5-year capital plan. It was in last year's budget document in the back. It's in this year's budget document in the back. And we generally try to, if it was real simple, you would just roll the next year in, but there's just always, the department says, okay, this is a little slight difference between I need this vehicle this year, I don't need that, et cetera, and all the other capital needs. But if you look at this slide, you got all the sources and uses. And I like to generally say, to be honest, it's really boiling down to the capital project fund and the stormwater capital project fund, because the other funds are basically committed to projects, the T-SPLOST projects and all that. And we're just now picking up some additional interest earnings and interest revenues that will go to the unallocated account. And then as those projects come forward and they need a little more money or that, then that will be dealt with. But they're sort of governed by the long-term plan that those T-SPLOST projects are funding that. So we don't reconstitute those appropriations. We don't bring them back forward. This is just that. So the new money in new projects is probably capital project fund and the stormwater fund. They're sitting on some fund balance themselves, unspent dollars that are not appropriated towards a project. And then the general fund, as we talked about, has $4 million. If you go all the way to the right, $4 million. It's going to put $2.4 million into the capital project and $1.6 million over in the stormwater fund. But that's that $4 million line item that the general fund has as a line item. The 9.4, which is the available fund balance of the general fund, is going over and funding the capital project funding. So when you get all said and done, some investment earnings, et cetera, and then you have, and there's some other sources, there's a grant, et cetera, we can talk about in a minute, but that fund has, those funds are $17.5 million of sources, and it's going to fund $15.7 million down below. If you see those between those two columns, 13.6 and the 2 million. So when we stand here a lot of times, how much is in unallocated, how much is in unallocated, that's generally talking about the capital project fund. And that will have, after, if this plan is adopted right here, herein, we'll have $1.9 million at your disposal. You could pick up some other project you felt we were wrong and we needed to put in or whatever, but you want to keep some, there's not a hard, fast number, but you generally would want to keep some because projects can come up during a year, serious capital projects that you'd like to have the ability to maneuver. So that's pretty much it, but if you know, obviously there's some other sources, including our LMIG grant and a additional grant for the North Point Parkway of $5 million, where we've already appropriated dollars in our T-SPLOST, and we've appropriated a good portion or a good bit in addition to that. But that's $5 million that if we get it, we have not gotten it yet, we won't appropriate it until we get the dollars. So we're just putting that directly into the North Point Parkway project.
Can I interject real quick?
Yep.
Tom, Mr. Mayor, if I could, just real quick, following up on that. So Tom's absolutely everything has been correct. The 1.9, I just want to throw out there that I've heard from a couple of elected officials some projects that might want to be suggested for use of that 1.9 million. One was the bringing back potentially of the Canton Street sidewalk extension project that we talked about from the Arts Center all the way up to, I think it was Vaughn Drive. That project that we brought forward to you at one point before for the possible allocation of stormwater funds, and it did not move forward, but that might be a project that, if it was a valid project, could come back and use some of those funds, as well as some additional work in the Jane Ellen neighborhood that deals with some further capital construction projects. I always get it wrong. They've done curbs and this would be streets, or they've done streets and this would be curbs? Okay, so to do some additional work in the Jane Ellen neighborhood. Just want to bring those up, that I've heard of those two projects, and if those were to get inserted, they would bring this 1.9 number down to whatever that net would be. And I'm sure you'll have some other ideas as to what you might want to see added at this stage of the game from that 1.9. Thanks, Tom.
Excellent. Yeah. So at that point, it's the laundry list on this presentation. It has the page number in the budget book. The budget book has obviously a lot more of the explanations of what those capital projects are and what they entail for the use of that 17 million or whatever that is. And so that's the following slides and following pages. And then we follow that up in slide 36 beginning, or 37 really, with the unfunded list of items, of capital items that was presented in the 2025 budget. I would say that, again, what you see as the funded portion is very similar to last year's year one, or I guess that would have been year two of our 5-year CIP, because it primarily is always going to deal with 2 to 4 million for stormwater. I think this year we have it at 2 million because they are sitting on some dollars in a sense. I mean, the plan was 4 million because it's $40 million of projects over 10 years, but they are sitting on 6 million or so that's committed, but it's not spent, and it doesn't have a line item for where it's completely go. So the concept there was to do that. But again, it's 2 to 4 million. You got to be getting, or you're going to wake up one day and have $40 million of projects you haven't done. So that's one number. Milling resurfacing is easily 4 million out of the general fund, coming close, to maintain the 525 lane miles or whatever. Fleet is over probably close to 2.3, 2.4 when you take in that $1.9 million of it is public safety, just to replace 25 cars a year. So you add those numbers up, you're looking at a nut you got to crack every year in the neighborhood of 15 million. So, it's an art between that $4 million line and being enough conservative on our revenue expense to make sure we can feed that into the capital program. So again, there's the unfunded as well, and then we end with, I think we have the dates of the hearings. We wrote down there, if needed, a special called budget workshop. Not sure if we're going to get murdered for putting that down here, but then there's obviously the first public hearing, second public hearing, and the third public hearing. That's it from a high-level presentation, hopefully.
Do we have any questions? Councilman Dorito?
Thank you, Mayor. First, thank you for much money to do it all. So I like the way some of these things came out. So I have just a few questions, maybe 4 or 5, real quick. On page 13, under the fiscal '25 recommended base budget, the merit programs, you're averaging 4%, even though in the actual budget document, I think it says 2%, right? And then you have the market-based personal compensation adjustments. Are those two different numbers?
Yes, what slide is it again? I'm sorry.
Number 13.
13.
I didn't know if
Oh,
that-
yeah, I'm sorry.
Is the 914,000 included in that?
It is not.
It is not.
That is, and to be honest,
what I thought. I just wanted to
that
make
is an actual, one of the operating initiatives for
Okay.
you all to vote in on.
I may ask Chris a question on that later. If you go to page, let's see if I need to ask a question this. No, I'll skip that one. I can talk offline on that one. And maybe I'll save this for Chief Robertson on the fire training lieutenant. Just want to understand that a little bit more. So I don't know, we'll do it
It'd be
when.
best.
You want to do that later, Mayor, the department directors, or just go with Tom right now?
If you could just get it on the record.
Yeah,
We've got
I just
about
want to
8
understand the
minutes
fire
before we-
training lieutenant, because I
Yeah.
know in the unfunded portion of the presentation, we talked about a captain. I'm trying to understand that program, and so
Okay.
I'll ask the chief about that later. Oh, on the revenue comparison, what is our tax collection rate right now as far as?
97 to 98 in the fiscal year.
And that's pretty
itself,
good,
yeah.
right?
And then you pick up
Comparison.
some of it, you even get closer ultimately probably by delinquent the next year, which we bring that revenue in as well, yeah.
Okay. Can you explain the hexagon system that you made reference?
Yeah, that's the new CAD system, or
the
computer aided
CAD system.
dispatch, and what's the other term I'm looking
Got you.
for? Record management, yeah, RMS.
Okay. Okay, that's on that one. Yeah, I'll save that for the chief. I'm almost done. There was one page, I don't know where it was, on the pension. I'm just curious, that pension number in the budget is for the previous defined plan, right?
I think when it says pension here, and I can't remember what slide, I think it's
Can't remember.
including all of them. It's combined, right?
It is combined.
Yeah, yeah. It's the 401.
As far as the funding level of the pension fund, the defined plan, do you know what percentage that is at?
From a market value, it dropped because it was at 95%, then it dropped back down to, when we had the little bit of dip 2 years ago, then it dropped down to 80-something. So on a market value, I think it's at 80, high 80s or mid 80s. And then on the actuarial value base, it's probably around 83 to 84%, which is about standard, or actually it's better than probably most places. But we get the actual report, tells us how to continue to fund that. So
Thank you, Tom.
Yep.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Mayor.
Councilman Mitchell?
Concerning the pension, I understand that with the new direction and leadership of investment advisors, that we're on the right track again, right?
yes,
As far as getting that back up to 95?
yes. I mean, obviously, market value can fluctuate on a given date, but we now have Chris Lagerbloom on the board, so he'll share some of that responsibility with me. So.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you.
It's all on your shoulders, Chris.
Any other questions?
Thought I would end
or-
on a good note.
Any other questions or input? I'll just note for the record, so give everybody a heads up, I've had some of these discussions before, but there were 3 items that I have questions about. We won't take them up now because we've got a council meeting coming up. But one of the things I'd like Pete and his team to look at in the capital budget was the $575,000 for the North Main Street plantings and landscaping. I'm just not confident that we'll actually be spending any money on the North Main Street in the next 12 months of the fiscal year. So let's take a look at that. If we're not going to be spending it next year, we might be able to apply it somewhere that we could actually get something. But it's it's definitely got to be done. I'm just doubting the timing. The other are two things, and I've spoken to Director Cook about this, but I just wanted to get them out there, is that the design for the Alpharetta entry monuments is $150K. That just seems excessive for design of entry monuments for the city. So I wanted us to take a look at that again, and especially given the price. We've got two other gateways, the Brookside Gateway and the South Main Gateway, where the construction's $150 and $225. So I just wanted us to really go back into that one a little bit. But other than that, I'm appreciative of the efforts of our leadership team and finance team. Councilman Will, did you have any other questions or input about the budget? Well, you had mentioned something to me earlier. Okay. We'll have more work sessions. So unless there's any other input, we'll go ahead and, do we need to vote on the work session? Ms. Eswine, do we have to vote to end the work session? Okay, good. So ladies and gentlemen, we're going to adjourn from this work session for a few minutes before we begin our 6:30 council meeting.